The walls were still standing. That alone was strange. Everything else on that hillside had collapsed decades ago. The timber frames, the storage sheds, the old fence posts rotted down to stubs barely above the frozen ground. But the walls stood. 4 of them. Solid, dark, and patient. Rising nearly 6 feet out of the earth. Each one almost 20 inches thick, stacked from rough-cut sandstone and river granite by hands that had been dead for over a century. Most people who came across them saw a hazard. A pile of old rock. Something to walk around. He saw something else entirely. It was late October when he first put his hand flat against the stone. The air outside was already dropping below freezing at night. But the wall was warm. Not from the sun. The sun had already moved behind the ridge an hour before. The warmth came from somewhere deeper inside the rock itself. A slow, steady release. Quiet and deliberate like breathing. He didn't say a word to anyone about what he was planning. Not first, when word finally got out that he intended to put a roof over those old fort walls and actually live there through the winter. The reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Laughter. Concern. The kind of head shaking that means people have already decided you're wrong and are just waiting for the cold to prove it. What nobody understood, what nobody even thought to ask, was what 20 inches of stacked stone actually does when the temperature outside falls to 4 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind is driving hard out of the northwest. They didn't know. But the soldiers who first built those walls, more than 100 years before, had figured it out. Not because they were engineers, because they were cold, they were isolated, and they had no other choice. This is the story of what those walls remembered and what one man was quiet enough to hear. If you've ever looked at an old ruin and wondered whether it still had something left to teach, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. You might be closer to this kind of wisdom than you think. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over an abandoned military post. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of things that were built to last and then simply left behind, structures that outlived their purpose without ever failing at their job. The outpost in question had been constructed sometime in the 1870s, during the expansion era when small garrison forts were established across the high country frontier to support survey crews and supply routes through the mountains. These were not grand installations. They were not the stone fortresses of European military tradition. They were working structures, built fast, built rough, and built to endure winters that averaged over 140 inches of snowfall per season and temperatures that could plunge to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a stretch. The soldiers who built them were not architects. They were infantrymen, laborers, and frontier carpenters operating under quartermaster specifications that prioritized function over everything else. And yet, within those utilitarian constraints, the men who raised those walls made choices that modern builders rarely make anymore. Choices driven not by theory, but by the absolute necessity of surviving in an environment that punished every mistake with brutal efficiency. The wall construction followed what regional records describe as a double-course rubble fill technique. 2 outer faces of shaped fieldstone, with the interior cavity packed tightly with smaller broken stone, dry-set clay, and compacted earth. The result was a wall that measured between 18 and 22 inches thick, depending on the section, with some corner sections reportedly reaching nearly 24 inches. This was not decorative. It was not excess. Every extra inch of stone represented a deliberate calculation about heat. Sandstone and granite, the 2 primary materials sourced from the surrounding hillside, behaved differently under thermal stress, and the builders, whether by instinct or inherited knowledge, mixed them in a way that proved remarkably effective. Sandstone absorbs heat at a moderate rate and releases it slowly, acting as a buffer against rapid temperature swings. Granite, denser and harder, holds more raw thermal energy per unit of volume. Together, layered in rough alternation, they created a wall that functioned less like a barrier and more like a battery. The garrison was decommissioned by the early 1890s. Oral accounts from nearby settlements described the buildings being stripped of their timber roofs and interior woodwork within a decade. Lumber was scarce and valuable. What remained were the stone walls, considered too heavy and too fixed to move. So they stayed. Season after season, decade after decade. The frost cracked the mortar in places, the ground shifted slightly, and the surrounding landscape slowly swallowed the lower courses in soil and vegetation. By the time our man found them more than a century later, the walls rose between 5 and 6 feet from grade, enclosing a rectangular footprint roughly 22 feet by 18 feet, approximately 396 square feet of interior floor space. The original entrance was still identifiable from the gap in the eastern wall, now partially filled with tumbled stone. To most eyes, what remained was a ruin. Historically interesting, perhaps. Practically useless, certainly. But standing inside those 4 walls on a cold October afternoon, feeling the temperature shift the moment you stepped out of the wind and into that stone enclosure, something else became apparent. The walls weren't just standing. They were still working. They had never stopped. They had simply been waiting for someone to close the roof again. Word travels fast in small, rural communities, and nowhere faster than when someone announces a plan that strikes the locals as spectacularly misguided. The man, call him Garrett, a name that appears in the informal community records of the area, had been living on the land adjacent to the old outpost for just over 2 years when he made his intentions known at a gathering in late October. He planned to spend the coming winter in the old fort walls. He would build a roof. He would use the existing stone enclosure as his primary shelter. He would not be constructing a new cabin. The response was immediate and nearly unanimous. A neighbor who was present later recalled the reaction as somewhere between genuine concern and open amusement. The walls were over 100 years old. They had no roof, no floor, no insulation. There was no chimney, no stove connection, no window framing, no door. The interior was open to the sky, partially filled with decades of wind-blown debris and collapsed mortar. The idea of turning that ruin into a livable winter shelter, in a region where January temperatures regularly fell below zero, struck most of the people in that room as, at best, deeply optimistic. At worst, dangerous. What nobody said out loud, but most seemed to feel, was that there was something almost embarrassing about the plan. There were proper ways to build a winter shelter. There were lumber yards within a day's drive. There were prefabricated structures, steel-framed kit buildings, insulated panels. The tools of the modern age were available. Why would anyone choose a pile of 19th century rubble over proven contemporary materials? Garrett listened. He thanked people for their concern, and then he went back to the hillside and kept working. What his neighbors couldn't see, what wasn't obvious from the outside, was how much Garrett had already studied those walls before committing to the plan. He had spent the better part of 2 weeks doing something that looks, to the uninformed observer, like simply standing around. He walked the perimeter at different times of day, pressing his palm flat against different sections of stone. He took temperature readings with a basic infrared thermometer, inside the enclosure versus outside. He noted which walls caught morning sun and which stayed in shadow. He measured the wall thickness at multiple points using a long probe inserted into a crack near the base of the north wall. What he found was not a ruin in thermal terms. It was a functioning mass thermal system that had been running passively, silently, without any human maintenance for over a century. Even without a roof, even open to the sky, the interior of that stone enclosure held measurably more heat than the surrounding landscape. On a clear afternoon, when the exterior air temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, Garrett recorded an interior ambient temperature of 36 degrees Fahrenheit, a difference of 8 degrees Fahrenheit, achieved by nothing more than 4 walls and the physics of stone. With a roof, those numbers would change entirely. His neighbors thought he was betting on a ruin. He knew he was betting on 80,000 pounds of slowly breathing stone. The roof would be the key. The roof would transform what was already there into something none of them expected. And that was exactly what he wanted to prove. Before Garrett drove a single nail into the roof structure, he did something that would have made immediate sense to any stonemason from the 1700s and would strike most modern contractors as an almost comical waste of time. He read the walls, not with instruments at first, with his hands, his eyes, and a patience that the surrounding environment, open sky, cold wind, shortening days, seemed intent on punishing. He moved along each of the 4 walls in sequence, working from the base upward, pressing his fingers into the joints between courses, testing the stability of individual stones, looking for the geometry hidden inside what appeared to be rough, random stacking. It was not random. What the original builders had understood, and what the wall revealed under close inspection, was that the placement of every major stone had been governed by two priorities: structural load distribution and thermal continuity. The larger, flatter stones were seated at intervals that spread the weight evenly across the lower courses. The irregular gaps between them were packed with smaller spall stones and clay fill, not merely to hold the structure together, but to prevent the thermal short circuits that would occur if air could move freely through the wall mass. A wall with air gaps is a wall that leaks heat. The cold on one side finds a path through the barrier, and the warmth stored inside the stone bleeds away faster than the mass can replenish it. The original builders had sealed those paths, not with precision masonry, but with an instinctive understanding that any gap in the fill was a failure point. Garrett identified 3 sections of the north wall where the original clay packing had deteriorated and fallen away, leaving visible voids between the outer and inner stone faces. These are not structural problems. The wall was stable, but they were thermal problems. Cold air could enter those voids, circulate through the interior of the wall cavity, and strip heat from the stone from the inside. Before the roof went on, those sections needed to be repointed with a lime-based mortar, a material that, importantly, remains slightly flexible under freeze-thaw cycles, unlike modern Portland cement, which can crack and spall when the temperature swings. He also noted the orientation of the 4 walls with precision. The south-facing wall received direct sunlight from roughly 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon at this latitude and season, approximately 6 hours of direct solar gain per day, even in November. That wall, by Garrett's infrared measurements, ran consistently 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on its interior face than the north wall by mid-afternoon. It was, in effect, a passive solar collector. A 22-foot-long, 20-inch thick solar collector that required no panels, no wiring, and no maintenance. The east and west walls acted as thermal buffers, absorbing the temperature differential between the warmer south mass and the colder north exposure, and moderating the interior climate across the full 24-hour cycle. At dawn, when exterior temperatures bottomed out, those walls were still releasing heat they had collected more than 12 hours earlier. This is the principle of thermal lag, the delay between when a material absorbs heat and when it releases it. In a dense stone wall of 20 inches or more, that lag can run between 8 and 12 hours. What warms the stone at noon keeps the interior warm at midnight. The old fort builders didn't have a name for this phenomenon. They simply knew, from experience and from older traditions passed down through military construction manuals and frontier building guides, that thick stone walls were warm walls, not because of what they kept out, but because of what they held in. By the time Garrett finished his survey of the walls, he had a precise picture of what he was working with. 3 sections to repoint, 1 dominant solar gain wall to optimize, 1 primary heat loss exposure to address in the roof design, and approximately 80,000 pounds of stone, by rough estimate, based on the wall volume and average density of the mixed sandstone granite construction, waiting to be put back to work. He ordered the lime mortar. He sharpened his pointing tools, and he started filling gaps. The roof was the variable that everything else depended on. A wall, by itself, is a thermal mass with no lid. It absorbs heat, yes. It releases it slowly, yes. But without a ceiling to trap that released warmth inside the enclosed space, the heat simply rises and disperses into the open air. The walls of the old fort had been doing exactly that for decades, collecting solar energy every clear day, warming slowly, and then radiating that warmth upward into nothing. A complete and invisible cycle of effort with no beneficiary. The roof would change the physics of the entire structure. It would transform a radiating mass into a contained thermal system. Heat absorbed, heat retained, heat recirculated through the enclosed air volume. The difference, in practical terms, was the difference between a campfire and a stove. One broadcasts energy in all directions. The other directs it. Garrett's roof decision was shaped by three constraints that he had identified during his wall survey. First, the load-bearing capacity of the existing walls. The original stone courses, while structurally sound, had not been designed to carry a heavy modern roof system. Any spanning structure would need to transfer its load carefully to the wall tops without creating point concentrations that could fracture the aged masonry. Second, the snow load requirements for the region. Local building knowledge suggested designing for at least 40 pounds per square foot on a flat projection, which dictated a minimum roof pitch to shed accumulation before it could build to dangerous weight. Third, and most critically from a thermal standpoint, the roof needed to function as an insulating layer, not merely a weatherproof covering. What Garrett settled on was a modified purlin and rafter system built from locally milled timber, with a pitch of approximately 6 and 12, a moderate slope that would shed snow efficiently without creating excessive interior volume that the stone walls would struggle to heat. The rafters were seated on a pressure-treated top plate anchored to the interior face of the stone walls, distributing the roof load along the full length of each wall rather than concentrating it at specific points. The insulation layer was the element that drew the most comment from people who eventually saw the finished structure. Garrett used a combination of rigid mineral wool board, chosen for its fire resistance and its ability to maintain performance when damp, and a secondary layer of loose-fill insulation above the ceiling decking, bringing the total roof assembly to an effective insulation value of approximately R38. For a structure with 20-inch stone walls, that number matters enormously. Here is why. The stone walls themselves have a relatively low insulation value in the modern engineering sense. 20 inches of sandstone and granite provides roughly R2 to R3 of insulation, far below what a modern insulated wall achieves. But that framing misses the point entirely. The walls are not insulating. They're storing. They're a thermal battery, not a thermal barrier. The roof, by contrast, performs pure insulation, preventing the warm interior air from escaping through the ceiling, the primary direction of heat loss in any enclosed space. The combination of high-mass walls and a high-insulation roof creates a system where each component does what it does best. The stone absorbs and releases heat slowly, buffering the interior temperature against the wild swings of the exterior climate. The roof prevents the warm air trapped above from leaking away before the occupant can benefit from it. Together, they create an interior environment that is not just warm, it is stable. The temperature inside the completed structure, according to Garrett's record from that first winter, rarely swung more than 6 degrees Fahrenheit across a full 24-hour period, even when exterior temperatures dropped 40 degrees overnight. A modern stick-framed cabin with fiberglass bat insulation and 2x6 walls can lose that thermal stability in less than 2 hours of below-zero temperatures if the heating source fails. The stone structure, by contrast, would hold its temperature gradient for between 18 and 24 hours before the interior began to cool significantly, even with no fire burning. The neighbors have been watching the roof go up with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. They saw timber. They saw corrugated metal roofing panels going on over the decking. They saw what looked from the outside like a simple shed roof dropped onto old ruins. They couldn't see the thermal logic underneath it. They couldn't see what was about to happen when winter arrived. But it was coming, and it would explain everything. There is a version of heat that most people never experience. Not the sharp, aggressive warmth of a forced air register blasting from the floor, and not the dry, directional heat of a space heater pointed at your ankles. It is something slower and more complete. It comes from all directions at once, quiet, and even like standing inside something that has decided to take care of you. That is radiant heat from thermal mass. And understanding why it works requires setting aside almost everything modern construction culture teaches about warmth. In the contemporary building world, insulation is the answer to cold. The logic is straightforward. Keep the cold out, trap the warm air in, and use a mechanical system to generate heat on demand. This approach works. It is effective, predictable, and measurable in ways that satisfy engineers and energy codes. But it is also, in a fundamental sense, reactive. It responds to cold rather than anticipating it. The moment the heat source stops, the furnace shuts off, the propane runs out, the power fails. The interior begins to cool immediately because the structure itself holds almost no thermal energy. The walls are barriers, not batteries. A 20-inch stone wall operates on an entirely different principle. Stone, particularly the dense, mixed mineral compositions found in sandstone and granite, has what physicists call high specific heat capacity. This means it takes a significant amount of energy to raise the temperature of the material, but it also means that once the material is warm, it releases that energy very slowly. Water has the highest specific heat capacity of any common substance, which is why coastal climates are milder than inland ones. Stone sits well below water on that scale, but far above timber, drywall, or the air itself. For a wall of sandstone and granite measuring 20 inches thick, the thermal math works out roughly as follows. During daylight hours, when solar radiation strikes the south-facing wall and ambient temperatures are at their daily peak, the outer surface of the stone warms first. That warmth conducts inward, slowly, because stone is not a good conductor in the electrical sense, but steadily because the mass is enormous and the temperature differential drives the process continuously. By late afternoon, the heat has migrated several inches into the wall. By midnight, it has reached the interior face and begins radiating into the enclosed space. This is thermal lag made physical. The wall is, in effect, a slow-motion heat delivery system. What the sun deposited at noon arrives inside the cabin at midnight, precisely when the exterior temperature has dropped to its lowest point and the occupant needs it most. Garrett's own records from that first winter document this phenomenon with useful precision. On a clear December day, when the exterior high temperature reached 31 degrees Fahrenheit and the overnight low fell to 7 degrees Fahrenheit, a swing of 24 degrees, the interior of the stone structure varied between 54 degrees Fahrenheit at its coldest, just before dawn, and 61 degrees Fahrenheit at its warmest, in the early evening hours when the wall's delayed heat release was at its peak. That represents an interior temperature swing of only 7 degrees Fahrenheit across the full 24-hour cycle, against an exterior swing of 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Without a fire, without any supplemental heat source, just stone, a roof, and physics. For comparison, a conventionally framed cabin of similar floor area, 2x6 stud walls, are 21 fiberglass batts, no active heating, would typically see interior temperatures track the exterior fairly closely once the building lost its initial heat load. In similar conditions, such a structure might fall to within 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit of the exterior overnight low, putting the interior well below 20 degrees Fahrenheit by morning. The stone structure, in the same conditions, held above 54 degrees Fahrenheit. That gap, more than 30 degrees Fahrenheit, is not insulation. It is storage. The difference also shows up in firewood consumption. Garrett burned, by his own account, between 1.8 and 2.2 cords of wood across his first full winter in the stone structure. Local accounts suggest that comparable timber-framed cabins in the same valley, with similar floor areas and similar stove setups, were burning between 4 and 5 cords per season. The stone walls were not just holding warmth. They were reducing the total energy demand of the structure by absorbing excess heat from the stove during firing periods and releasing it slowly through the night, functioning, in the language of modern building science, as passive thermal storage integrated directly into the structure itself. The soldiers who built those walls in the 1870s did not have the vocabulary of thermal lag, specific heat capacity, or passive solar gain. But they had something equally powerful: the memory of having been cold, and the determination to build something that would make sure they never were again. They stacked the stone thick because thin walls had failed them before. They filled every gap because gaps meant drafts and drafts meant suffering. They built what they needed, and what they needed turned out to be a system that still worked flawlessly more than 100 years after the last soldier walked away from it. Stone doesn't lie. It doesn't depreciate. It doesn't require maintenance contracts or energy audits. It simply holds what you give it and gives it back when you need it most. November arrived quietly that year. the way the worst winters sometimes do. Not with a dramatic early blizzard, but with a slow, gray, patient cold that settled into the valley like something that intended to stay. By the second week of November, Garrett had moved into the structure. The roof was complete. The three repointed sections of the north wall had cured fully. A small cast-iron box stove, a second-hand unit he had sourced from a farm sale, rated for a firebox capacity of roughly 1.8 cubic feet, sat on a flagstone hearth he had built from flat pieces of the same sandstone pulled from the debris inside the original enclosure. The stovepipe ran up through a thimble in the roof decking and out through a metal flashing collar, with a rain cap above. The door, a solid timber frame with a wool blanket serving as a temporary draft seal, closed the original entrance gap in the east wall. It was not finished in any decorative sense, but it was closed, tight, and ready. The first real test came on the night of November 19th. Garrett's journal, preserved in photocopied excerpts that have been shared in regional homesteading circles, records the details with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The exterior temperature dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight. Wind out of the northwest at an estimated 20 to 25 miles per hour, driving the wind chill well below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of night that finds the weaknesses in everything. He had fired the stove for approximately 3 hours in the early evening, burning 2 medium split pieces of dry pine and 1 larger piece of dense hardwood. A short, controlled burn rather than a sustained all-night fire. By 9 p.m., he damped the stove down to a low smolder and noted the interior temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He then went to sleep. He woke at 5:30 a.m. The stove had been out for hours. He checked the thermometer he had mounted on the interior face of the north wall, away from any direct radiant influence of the stove. The reading was 57 degrees Fahrenheit. He checked it twice. 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior air temperature, after a night, at 4 degrees Fahrenheit outside, with no active heat source burning for more than 8 hours. For several minutes, he simply sat with that number. Not because it surprised him. He had calculated it would hold somewhere in that range. But because there is a difference between predicting something on paper and feeling it with your body in a room that should, by every intuition modern culture has built around shelter, have been approaching dangerous cold by morning. The walls had lost only 11 degrees Fahrenheit across the night. The exterior had swung 24 degrees below what the interior held at its lowest point. The gap between inside and outside, at the coldest moment of the coldest night of the season so far, was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Over the following weeks, the pattern held with remarkable consistency. On nights when the exterior temperature fell between 0 degrees Fahrenheit and 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior, after an evening fire and overnight smolder, held between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 60 degrees Fahrenheit by dawn. On the coldest recorded night of that winter, January 14th, when the thermometer outside read minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior dropped to 49 degrees Fahrenheit by early morning. Cold enough to see your breath. Not cold enough to be dangerous. Not cold enough to freeze the water bucket sitting 3 feet from the north wall. By contrast, oral accounts from 2 neighboring homesteaders that winter described mornings when they woke to interior temperatures in their timber-framed cabins of 35 degrees Fahrenheit and 38 degrees Fahrenheit respectively, despite having kept fires burning longer than Garrett had. Their walls were releasing the cabin's heat to the outside almost as fast as the stove could generate it. His walls were doing the opposite. The stove itself became a different instrument inside the stone structure. In a conventional cabin, a wood stove fights a constant battle against heat loss through the walls. You burn to replace what the structure is losing. Inside the stone enclosure, the walls were actively contributing to the thermal environment rather than depleting it. Garrett found that he could heat the interior to a comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit with a 2-hour evening fire, then allow the stove to cool completely and wait to temperatures that required only a short morning fire, 30 to 45 minutes of burning, to bring the space back to comfortable levels for the day. His firewood consumption reflected this directly. By mid-February, he had burned through approximately 1.2 cords of his stockpile. At the same point in a previous winter, spent in a rented timber frame cabin of similar size in the same valley, he had burned nearly 2.8 cords and still struggled with cold mornings. The stone was doing the work that the wood had been doing before, silently, without flame, without tending, without any input from him beyond the initial decision to trust it. January passed. February came and went. The valley saw 3 significant storms. One that dropped nearly 22 inches of wet snow over 36 hours, loading the roof to near its design limit and testing the structural connection between the new timber system and the old stone wall tops. The connection held without movement. The walls, set into bedrock and compacted earth over more than a century, did not shift. By the first week of March, when the angle of the sun had risen enough to push afternoon temperatures above freezing on clear days, Garrett noted something that he had not fully anticipated. The south wall, now receiving stronger daily solar input, was beginning to warm so effectively during afternoon hours that he occasionally needed to open the door briefly to prevent the interior from becoming uncomfortably warm. A 100-year-old ruin was overheating his cabin in early spring. He wrote in his journal that night, in a line that local accounts suggest he later repeated more than once. "I've been worried about keeping warm all winter. Turns out I should have been more worried about keeping cool." The visits started in February. It wasn't organized. Nobody announced they were coming to inspect the old fort structure or verify what Garrett had been claiming, because Garrett hadn't been claiming anything. He had been quiet about the whole winter, answering questions with brief, factual responses when people asked, and offering no elaboration beyond what was directly requested. He was not, by temperament, a man who needed to be proven right out loud. But word travels in small communities, and the simple fact that the stone structure was occupied, visibly occupied, with smoke rising from the stovepipe on cold mornings and lamplight showing through the gap of the eastern wall in the evenings, was itself a kind of ongoing statement that people couldn't quite ignore. The first neighbor to come by deliberately arrived on a Saturday morning in early February, a day when the overnight low had been -3 degrees Fahrenheit and the morning temperature was still sitting at 8 degrees Fahrenheit. He arrived expecting, on some level, to find Garrett cold, uncomfortable at minimum, perhaps quietly ready to admit the experiment had its limits. He found him at a small workbench he had set up along the south wall, working on a piece of harness leather with his coat off. His coat was hanging on a peg near the door. The visitor, according to his own later account shared in the community newsletter, stood in the entrance for a moment and said nothing. He had walked half a mile through 8 degrees Fahrenheit air to get there. His hands were in his gloves, and his breath was fogging heavily. Inside the stone enclosure, the air was still. There was no active fire in the stove. The interior temperature, which he checked by asking Garrett directly, was 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Garrett had fired the stove the previous evening and not touched it since. The visitor took off his own coat within 5 minutes of entering. Over the following 3 weeks, 6 more people made their way to the structure, some out of genuine curiosity, 1 or 2 out of what seemed like a reluctance to continue doubting something that the evidence was making increasingly difficult to dismiss. Each of them noticed the same things in roughly the same order. The stillness of the air inside, the absence of drafts, the way the temperature seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, and the stove, cold to the touch on most visits, sitting silent in the corner while the room remained comfortably warm. Several of them pressed their hands against the interior face of the south wall and remarked on its warmth. This was the detail that seemed to stop people most completely. The wall wasn't just not cold, it was radiating. On a sunny afternoon in late February, the interior surface of that south-facing stone wall registered nearly 72 degrees Fahrenheit to the touch. The exterior air that day was 24 degrees Fahrenheit. The wall's interior face was 48 degrees warmer than the outside air. Not because of the stove, because of the sun, delayed by 12 hours of thermal travel through 20 inches of sandstone and granite. One visitor, a man who had built 3 timber frame cabins over a lifetime of homesteading and considered himself well-versed in the realities of cold climate shelter, walked the perimeter of the interior slowly, examining the wall joints, the flagstone hearth, the roof connection at the wall tops. He asked Garrett a series of technical questions about the re-pointing compound, the roof insulation value, the stovepipe clearances. Then he stood in the center of the room for a long moment and said, in a tone that mixed admiration with something that sounded almost like irritation at himself, "I've been burning 5 cord a year for 30 years. For 30 years. He paused. I built 3 new cabins and never once thought to look for an old wall." That sentence, repeated in various forms across multiple accounts of that winter, captures something important about what the stone structure revealed. Not just about thermal physics, but about how the accumulated knowledge of earlier builders gets lost when each generation assumes that newer materials are better materials, that modern methods have superseded old ones, that the ruins scattered across the landscape are ruins because they failed rather than because they were abandoned. The old fort walls had not failed. They had simply lost their roof. The knowledge built into them, in every thick course of stone, every packed clay joint, every deliberate choice of material and orientation, had been sitting on that hillside intact, waiting for someone to recognize it for what it was. What the neighbors saw that winter was not a curiosity. It was a correction, a quiet, stone-cold correction delivered by a structure that had been teaching the same lesson for over 100 years. To anyone willing to walk inside and pay attention. Stand inside a new home today, any new home, built to current code, fully insulated, mechanically heated and cooled, and try to feel the walls. You can't. They give you nothing. They are barriers, membranes, legal minimums. They keep the weather out, and they hold the conditioned air in, and they do these things acceptably well. But they do not participate in the thermal life of the building. They are passive in the worst sense of the word, present but inert, doing only what they are forced to do by the mechanical systems humming behind them. This is not an accident of laziness or ignorance. It is the logical outcome of a building culture that, over the course of the 20th century, made a deliberate trade. Mass for speed. Thermal participation for thermal separation. The heavy, slow, intelligent wall for the thin, fast, insulated one. The trade made sense, economically, in its historical context. After World War II, the demand for housing in North America was enormous. The labor pool was limited, and the pressure to build quickly and cheaply was intense. Dimensional lumber, standardized, predictable, easy to work with hand tools and power saws, became the dominant structural material for residential construction. A stud wall framed from 2x4 or 2x6 lumber, sheathed in plywood, wrapped in house wrap, and filled with fiberglass insulation could be assembled by a small crew in a fraction of the time required to lay even a modest stone wall. For the purposes of the post-war housing boom, it was the right tool for the job. But somewhere in that transition, an understanding was lost. The understanding that a building can store energy, not just resist its loss. That mass and insulation are not competing strategies, but complementary ones. That a wall with high thermal mass does not need to be highly insulated to be highly effective, because its effectiveness comes from a different mechanism entirely. Modern building codes in most North American jurisdictions require wall insulation values ranging from R13 to R21 for residential construction, depending on climate zone. These requirements are based on models of heat loss through the building envelope. Models that treat the wall as a static barrier and calculate how quickly heat moves through it under steady-state conditions. What those models do not fully capture is dynamic thermal mass behavior. The way a high-mass wall stores energy during warm periods and releases it during cold ones, shifting the timing of heat delivery to match the building's actual needs. Research conducted in the latter half of the 20th century, including studies by national laboratories examining earth-sheltered and adobe construction, found that high-mass walls could achieve thermal performance equivalent to R20 or higher in certain climate profiles, despite having a static insulation value of R2 or R3. The key variables were the diurnal temperature swing of the local climate, the solar exposure of the wall faces, and the wall thickness. In climates with large day-night temperature swings, precisely the kind of climate that the old frontier outpost was built to survive, thermal mass walls outperformed their static insulation values significantly. None of this appears in the standard residential building code. None of it appears in the marketing materials for prefabricated wall panels or spray foam insulation. It is the kind of knowledge that lives in academic papers, in the memories of traditional builders, and in the walls of structures that have been quietly demonstrating it for a century or more, long after the people who built them walked away. Garrett's stone structure had an effective thermal performance that no building inspector would have predicted from a simple materials audit. 20 inches of mixed rubble stone, R22R, 3 static insulation value, R38 mineral wool roof assembly, code compliant, measurable, documentable. But the combined system, mass walls plus insulated lid, produced interior stability that the code-compliant timber alternative, with identical roof insulation and our 21 stud walls, could not match without a continuously operating mechanical heat source. The modern house, in many ways, is a machine for maintaining a temperature. The stone structure was something older and, in some respects, more capable, a body that maintained its own temperature, drawing on stored energy, smoothing the extremes, holding steady in the face of conditions that the machine requires constant fuel to resist. We stopped building bodies. We started building machines, and we called it progress. The machinery is not wrong, but the knowledge of what came before it, the understanding of mass, lag, orientation, and material intelligence, is not obsolete. It has simply been set aside, quietly abandoned, like a fort on a hillside, waiting for someone to recognize that the walls are still standing and still working. Spring came to the valley in early April, arriving the way it always does in high country, reluctantly, with false starts and late frosts that punish anything that moves too quickly toward warmth. By then, Garrett had spent 5 months inside the stone walls. He had recorded temperatures, tracked firewood consumption, noted the behavior of the structure under every kind of weather the season could produce. He had not been cold. He had not struggled. He had burned less than half the wood he expected, generated a fraction of the ash, and spent the deep midwinter months, the months when every other heated space in the valley demanded constant tending, with something that he described, more than once, as a feeling of having arrived somewhere fundamentally solid. There's a temptation, at the end of a story like this, to frame it as a triumph of the individual over conventional wisdom. The lone man who figured out what everyone else missed. The rugged independent who proved the skeptics wrong. But that framing misses the more important truth. Garrett did not figure out anything new. He did not invent a technique or discover a principle unknown to science. What he did was recognize something very old, something that had already been figured out by men who never went to school for engineering, who had no access to infrared thermometers or R-value charts, who built what they built because their lives depended on getting it right. The soldiers and laborers who constructed that outpost in the 1870s were drawing on a tradition of stone construction that ran back centuries through European military architecture, Scottish and Irish vernacular building, and the practical wisdom accumulated by anyone who had ever tried to stay warm in a cold climate using only what the land provided. They knew thick walls held heat because thin walls had failed before them, in other places in other winters, reported back through oral accounts and building manuals and the simple testimony of people who survived and people who didn't. They knew that a corner built right held a building together through freeze-thaw cycles that split poorly jointed masonry. They knew that the fill between the outer faces of a wall was not the cheap part. It was the thermal heart of the system, and filling it carelessly meant cold joints and drafts. They knew, without naming it, that the south face of a building was an asset to be maximized and the north face was a liability to be defended. What they built encoded all of that knowledge in physical form, not in a document that could be lost, not in a technique that could be forgotten when the last practitioner died. In stone, in the geometry of the walls, the thickness of the courses, the orientation of the structure on its hillside. The knowledge was in the walls themselves. It had been there the whole time. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the old fort. Not that stone is warm, or that thermal mass is effective, or that a good roof changes everything. All of those things are true and worth knowing. But the deeper lesson is about what happens when a culture stops reading its own built environment, when ruins become eyesores instead of libraries, When the assumption takes hold that anything old has been superseded, that anything that looks primitive must be less effective, that the only wisdom worth trusting comes with a label and a warranty. The walls have been teaching the same lesson since the day they were finished. They had taught it to the soldiers who shivered through their first mountain winter and then stopped shivering. They had taught it to the survey crews who camped in the shelter of the enclosure during storms, decades after the garrison left. They had been teaching it, silently, to every frost and wind that ran against their outer face for 150 years. Garrett was simply the first person in a very long time to stand inside and listen. The cold will always come. The question has never been whether it arrives, only whether you have built something capable of answering it. The fort knew. It always knew. It was just waiting for the roof. Historical and educational content only, not a substitute for professional engineering or building codes.